Good morning. Is this on, Dan? Am I functioning correctly here? I've got multiple wires working here. How about now? Thank you. It's working. Debbie, thank you for those kind words, and Dan and Jody, thank you for this opportunity to be here and just share some thoughts about what calling has come to mean for me. Debbie giving me those glowing words, the thought went through my head, gee, Debbie, you don't get out much, do you? But anyway, and I love watching the little ones up here. Children have a way of keeping us very humble, don't they, Jody? Calling is such an important idea. It has been for me. I think it's interesting that the Greek root for the word beauty is related to the word for calling. They both come from the Greek word kalon or kalein. And I think any of us that have ever seen someone who is really pouring who they are into what they do on a deep and beautiful, it is beautiful. It's an act of beauty. Whether they're planting a garden, carving a piece of wood, teaching a college class or a kindergarten class, if they're truly showing up with who they are at the deepest of levels and putting that into what they're doing, that's a beautiful act of calling, I think. The Bible is full of stories of calling. Abraham, the story of Moses that we've talked about this morning, Gideon, David, Jesus, the apostles, on and on. Stories of God inviting us to cross over into a new way of doing, which hopefully leads to a new way of being. When I think of calling, I very often think of vocation, and I think specifically of Frederick Buechner's definition of vocation, which I just love. Vocation, a word that comes from voice, also related to calling. But Buechner defines calling as that place where what brings you great joy meets a deep need in the world. That place where what brings you great joy meets a deep need in the world. That definition has stuck for me for a long time and is an act of beauty. I think when you can find something that you love to do and it is meeting a real need in the world. I teach educational leadership. So I teach graduate students that are getting their master's degree and doctorate degrees to become school leaders, to become principals and superintendents. I was a high school principal myself. And there's nothing more tragic than to walk into a classroom and see someone teaching that has lost any sense of calling that they maybe had at one point. It's not only tragic for the kids sitting in that room, but it's tragic for that teacher. Because I don't think any of us wants to go into a profession, into a service of some sort, and not be able to bring who we are into that work. And so becoming a high school principal opened my eyes a lot to what does it mean to answer the call to be a teacher, to serve children. I want to share a short story of it was really an initial calling for me. I was 24, 25. I had done my undergraduate degree in biology and chemistry, and I had been teaching high school biology, chemistry, and physics for a couple of years. And I had a summer job. This was in Arkansas. And summers in Arkansas are hot and humid. And I'd gotten a job building barbed wire fence with an older gentleman named Leroy Miller. Leroy was a man of very few words. In fact, if you look up reticent in the dictionary, it has a picture of Leroy Miller right there. He didn't say much, but he modeled for me that entire summer what it meant to work hard, what it meant to care, what it meant to stretch wire so that it would last, what it meant to dig a corner post that would stand up over the years. He taught me a lot in that regard, and I was trying to decide at this time whether I wanted to continue on as a high school teacher and coach or whether I wanted to go to medical school. I was thinking seriously about doing that. And so every day in this heat, while we're digging fence posts and driving posts and stretching wire, I'm yapping on and on and on incessantly about what am I going to do, Leroy? What am I going to do? What am I going to do with my life? I don't know what to do, Leroy. And I think really out of a sense of just deep irritation with hearing me go on and on about it. He never said anything, but one day when we were digging a corner post and we were having to really chisel out some rock, and he stopped and he looked at me and he said, "You know, Dave, yeah, I always figured that it didn't really matter that much what you do as long as when you get there, you love the people." And he kept digging. And I just sat there and I said to myself, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as when you get there, you love the people. My head just kind of went boom, exploded, and I held on to that, and I've been eternally grateful to Leroy for sharing that with me, because it has remained for me, it has given me a deep sense of calling, of vocation, of what it means no matter what you're doing, to bring who you are, your best self, your deepest self, to what it is you're doing. I'd like to share another story. This idea really is from Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward. I highly recommend it to you if you haven't read it. But he's using the story of Odysseus from the Odyssey by Homer. Here's a good one for you. I think you'll like this. What do you call a Greek poet flying over a fence? A Homer. Don't ever use homemade jokes. That's a bad idea. But anyway, we know the story, much of the story of the Odyssey. We've had to read Odysseus and his journeys. He's a great warrior, great hero, great sailor. He returns to Ithaca, and of course he has a lot of things there where he has to continue some of his heroic warrior behavior. But Tiresias, the blind prophet, comes to Odysseus and says, you need to do this. And Odysseus says, okay. And he says, you need to travel inland, away from Ithaca, away from the sea. And you need to keep going. You take an oar with you. And of course, the oar was a symbol of Odysseus's prowess as a sailor. And Tiresias says, I want you to keep traveling inward with this oar until you find someone who doesn't know what it is. Odysseus, to his credit, is willing to do this. So he heads inland, away from the sea, carrying this oar, and he meets people, and they say, oh yeah, that's an oar, you use that to the sea. So he keeps going. Finally, he comes to a farmer, and the farmer looks at him and says, oh yes, I know what that is. And Odysseus says, what is it? And he goes, it's a winnowing tool, a threshing tool. It's what we use to separate the grain from the chaff. Rohr goes on to explain metaphorically what's beautiful about that is that it wasn't until Odysseus traveled far enough inward and he came to a place where he learned what is important and what is not. And the chaff. And what had made him great now became the tool that helped him understand the difference between what is important and what is not. And it's at that point he can bury the ore at this place and return to his home. He finally does find someone, as I said, that helps him understand the difference between the important and the unimportant. And only as he was willing to travel inward did he discover the threshold between the two. That word threshold, perhaps calling, is always about crossing a threshold, a place where we discover what is important and what is not, a thin place, a liminal place between the internal and the external, a place where the soul or the heart and the mind meet. I had the good fortune a few years ago on campus to be invited to a presentation by a Native American elder. In the room, probably over 100 MSU faculty, many of them faculty, a lot of PhDs, a lot of brilliant people from all the various colleges on campus. And this Native American elder looks across this room, and the first words out of his mouth were, "I think the longest journey any of you will ever take is the 16 inches from here to here." And I just went, another Leroy Miller moment for me. My head, the top of my head blew off, and I went, wow, what a powerful insight to give to a group of people who've spent their lives being rewarded for what they've been able to do up here, and then to suddenly challenge them that you're only half a person until you start connecting here with here. And I think that for me, calling has always been about my willingness to cross liminal thresholds between what may appear important on the outside into deeply important places on the inside. And just as important, am I willing also to allow what is deeply important inside of me to cross over into my work on the outside? In other words, am I willing to allow my soul to show up? Whether I'm teaching, whether I'm building barbed wire fence, whether I'm selling something to someone in a business, am I willing to allow my deepest self to show up? Thresholds, liminal places, become places of great vulnerability. They are crossing over places from appearance to deep beingness. David Brooks wrote an essay, an op-ed a couple of years ago in the New York Times, in which he talks about our resume virtues, which are those things we carry into the marketplace, as opposed to what he calls our eulogy virtues, those qualities for which we hope to be remembered. Is it possible to bring all of these virtues into our careers, transforming them into callings? When we choose to hear calling, we choose to become vulnerable and to explore the deepest places within us. In doing this, we discover gifts and we discover limitations. We discover light and we discover shadows. Things we are that we want others to see, and things we hope no one ever sees. We discover what Parker Palmer calls our broken wholeness. It's here, too, that we discover what real compassion is. Otherwise, we'd go mad or cynical. We discover how to hold our own broken wholeness with gentleness and grace, which helps us express our gifts with humility. I share with my students the distinction between a scholar and an academic. Both have attained a mastery of their discipline, but there's a difference. A scholar has been humbled by the beauty and the complexity of her discipline, and she must profess it with a sense of wonder and humility. An academic, too, has mastered, but professes their mastery out of an arrogance with only a sense of conquest. Perhaps you've experienced these two kinds of professors. One that invites you into their discipline in such a wholehearted, beautiful way that you are desperate to be there. How many of us are sitting here maybe having committed our careers to disciplines that a professor like that called us to many years ago? And perhaps all of us, I'm sure we have, sat through classes where an academic, as I'm calling them, taught out of an arrogance that didn't invite us to be a part of what they knew. Some final thoughts. As we learn to hold our own broken wholeness with grace, why is community so important? I'll offer two reasons. We need others to help us be honest with ourselves because we are adept at lying to ourselves. I believe in a walk in the woods and the beautiful solitude and silence that can be found there and the self-reflection. But I know David Henderson, and I know how good I am at lying to myself. So it's in community that others hold me accountable to my willingness to self-deceive. The second reason is we also need others to hold our broken wholeness with compassion and love and integrity when we struggle to do that for ourselves. When another sees our brokenness and holds us in love, we know God in that moment. We know God in that relationship, as Martin Buber would suggest in his classic book, I and Thou. Of course, since every community, every organization, every collective is made up of individuals who have broken wholeness, whether they admit it or not, every community will have its own broken wholeness. MSU is a beautiful example of broken wholeness. This church is an example of broken wholeness. Bozeman, our community, is an example of broken wholeness. I worry about our national collective. Are we willing to examine our broken wholeness as a nation with integrity and love? Are we willing to bring critical thinking and critical love to those communities that we are a part of? So when Leroy Miller said to me, some almost 40 years ago now, it doesn't matter so much what you do, Dave, as long as when you get there you love the people, I think he meant all the people there. The together and not so together, the successful and not so successful, all of which, of course, we are. Basically, anyone with broken wholeness, including ourselves. I'm one of the people there. I need to love my own broken wholeness as I do what it is I do. And in so doing, my soul might show up better, and my compassion for the broken wholeness of those around me in all the communities I'm a part of might be more evident. As you travel this calling journey this year, I hope you hold each other's broken wholeness with love, and that in doing so you deepen your collective holding of First Presbyterian's beautiful broken wholeness. I think Jesus always called us to bring our full selves, our broken wholeness, into the world so we live undivided. Of course, this implies receiving others and each other without judgment. But maybe that's a whole nother talk. We need communities of faith now as much as ever. Thank you.